Hello and welcome. I've been on BookTube a few months now, a fair few months, so I thought it was time that you got to know me and my reading a bit more. So today I'm going to do a video about the books that made me. So these are the books from my childhood that either stood out to me or were quite formative. I'm going to do two of these videos. So today's is focusing on the books I read before I went to secondary school. So that would be books that I read before about the age of 11. And then I'm going to do another video, which are the books that I read while I was in secondary school. So 11 to 16. I'm probably going to actually do until 18 because I stayed on at my school's sixth form, so I was there until I was 18. There are some books that overlap, but I've tried to include them in the video that I feel are more fitting for them. But I also know that my memory of that time is not very accurate, so there'll also be some mistakes. But I don't think it really matters to you, and it doesn't really matter to me. So let's move on. Now, before I start talking about these books, I'll just talk a little bit about my history with reading. When I first started school, I struggled a lot, and I struggled a lot with reading as well. And I think it was only about halfway through primary school that the problems that I was having that were holding me back got sorted. And I, in essence, went from being one of the worst performers at school to one of the best performers. And in that time, I also discovered my love of reading, and I think my level of reading increased dramatically in a short period of time. But I can't really remember how old I was at this point, as it's so long ago now. But my love of reading has basically followed me from primary school up until now. So now, actually onto the books. So first were the Sweet Valley Twins and Sweet Valley High books. These were by Francine Pascal. I also read some of the Sweet Valley University books as well. I think I was in secondary school when I started reading them, and I didn't read that many. These books were about identical twins Jessica and Elizabeth. They had very different personalities, with Elizabeth being very bookish, a lot quieter, more thoughtful, more caring about other people, whereas Jessica could be a bit of a bitch at times. She was a lot more outgoing and adventurous, and whereas Elizabeth was really into writing, Jessica was a lot more into boys. They were both very social, but they didn't always hang out in the same social groups, and Jessica was always getting into trouble. Now, often she would drag Elizabeth into that trouble with her, and there were definitely siblings that fell out often, but also had each other's backs. So the books do tend to follow on from each other, but each one has its own contained plot, and you don't have to read all of them to understand what's going on, which I definitely didn't. I think there's well over 100 books, and I only had a few, but when I was looking at the summaries on Goodreads, I found that there were more that I recognised than I thought I did. So I'm not actually sure how many I have read. I do want to reread them at some point, but to do that I've got to get my hands on them again, as I got rid of them ages ago. I found this was a series that I really enjoyed. I related more to Elizabeth, but I enjoyed seeing the hijinks that Jessica would get into. And I think this series was definitely one where it felt like I was living through the characters. It's of course set in a different time. It's set perhaps in the 80s, I'm not sure, and set in America. So it's quite different to my own experiences, although there are also quite a lot of similarities as well, especially as the books tend to focus on them growing up, the different dramas in their lives. It sort of varied as to what happened. Sometimes the books were about problems they were having socially, like falling out with each other. Other times it involved things like Elizabeth being in a coma. So it varied a lot. I do have two specific memories tied to these books. So the second of the Sweet Valley Twins book, which was Teacher's Pet, I remember me and a friend acting them out. I think this was one of the earlier books that I got interested in, and I remember really enjoying myself. And then another memory is around the book In Love with the Enemy, which is book 120 in the Sweet Valley High series. That one I became briefly obsessed with. I remember being on the swings at the park, spending hours on them, and I was either thinking about this book, making up a story inspired by it, or singing a song that I created that was inspired by it. I do remember some people walking past and giving me a weird look. I don't blame them. It was probably not a very good song. I do actually remember some of the lyrics, something along the lines of, "We were 16, we were in love, why did you have to leave me?" And then the chorus was something about how they'd died and left me in a car crash. A bit dramatic, and I'm surprised that I had so much confidence to just be singing it, as I was a very shy child, but there we go. I also enjoyed reading the Babysitters Club books by Anne M. Martin. This was another series that I didn't read all the books from, and another series that is actually really long. So these books are about a group of friends who decide to set up a babysitters club. They want to do this because they think it will be fun and they think they'll make some money from it. And it is, and they do, but they also face so many problems. Sometimes it's because of the kids that they're looking after, sometimes it's because of the kids' parents, sometimes it's problems amongst themselves or problems with their family or in their personal life, but it's all very entertaining. They did remake the TV show a few years ago and both me and my sister watched it. Although it was aimed at much younger people than we are, we did enjoy it, and I think part of it was because of the nostalgia. They had also updated it for a more modern audience, but kept some of the same storylines in it as well, and that was quite interesting to see the changes they'd made and how they'd brought it up to date. I also read a lot of books from Enid Blyton, so there were books like The Naughtiest Girl, Famous Five, The Secret Seven, The Five Find Outers, The Magic Faraway Tree. Again, with the series, they tended to be series that you didn't need to read all the books to understand what was going on. There would be mentions of previous adventures, but they could easily be read as standalones. So many of the series, like The Famous Five, The Secret Seven, and The Five Find Outers, they were mystery adventures. And rather embarrassingly, when I read The Secret Seven, I wanted to form my own club, so I made badges, which were cardboard wrapped a lot in sellotape, and then I gave them to a few people that I wanted in my club, and they had no idea why I was giving them these badges, what I was on about, and weren't really interested. I have a feeling that I didn't explain myself very well, and I don't know whether they'd read the same sort of books as me, because these books were quite dated for that time as well. I think Enid Blyton started writing in the 1920s, so although these books had been very popular, I'm not sure how popular they were when I was a child, though I have heard of a few people talk about them, so they weren't exactly obscure either. I did reread The Secret Seven the other year, and it was okay, but they weren't really for me anymore, probably because I'm considerably older than the target audience. I do want to reread the Famous Five books at some point as well. If I remember correctly, they were aimed at children slightly older than The Secret Seven were, so that could mean that I enjoyed them more, but I could also be completely wrong. I do know that her books haven't aged so well. In some of the modern reprints, they've changed some of the sexist and racist language that's used, but I still found when reading The Secret Seven that they were quite derogatory to outsiders, and there were so many times when the girls stayed behind at home to help with the chores while the boys went and did the actual investigating, and there's quite a few times where it stuck to gender-specific roles for them, which I don't think I noticed when I read them as a child, but I definitely noticed them as an adult, and do know that when I read The Famous Five, my favourite character was George, who was a tomboy, because she was a lot more adventurous. But I feel that even young girls who aren't tomboys enjoy climbing trees, running around, and that such things aren't particularly gendered for children. But I guess, again, it's written in the 1920s. It's no surprise that there's racism and sexism in there, though I have seen some debate over whether people felt that her books were racist and sexist at the time as well. I think they were all the older books that I read as a child that I think had some sort of impact on me. I did try and read the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, but I couldn't really get into them. I actually tried them again in my late teens and found that I enjoyed them then. I think this was because I didn't think much of the underlying story, but I did enjoy looking at the allegory behind it, and when I first tried reading it as a small child, I didn't see that allegory. It was just something that I picked up as when I was a bit more mature. I also enjoyed The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I read this in year 6, so I think I would have been 10, 11, and I did then try and read The Lord of the Rings. I had a bind-up of them that I borrowed from my dad, and I got halfway through the second book and then DNF'd it. I have the other year, I finally got around to reading the trilogy, and I nearly DNF'd it in about the same point, so I'm not surprised that child me struggled with it. As adult me found it hard going as well. I much prefer The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. So moving on to books that were written closer to when I read them. So there's Harry Potter, of course. I think that was a highly formative read for me, especially as it sort of grew with me. I think I read the first book when I was 7 and then the last book when I was 14. So as well as the books maturing as they went along, so did I. And I think some of my maturing went alongside the books. Another series was the Wicca series by Cate Tiernan. So these are not all of the books. I do have them all, but the books that are earlier in the series I can't actually get to at the moment. But there's 15 in total, and they're known as the Sweep series in the US. So the ones I've got here are Spellbound, The Calling, Changeling, Strife, Seeker, Eclipse, Origins, Reckoning, Full Circle, and Night's Child, which is considerably bigger than the rest, because this one, the last one, is set multiple years after the main series. But the series as a whole is about Morgan, whose life is changed when she's introduced to witchcraft. I loved this series, and it was one where I pretty much read each book back to back. As well as dealing with the normal problems that teenagers face, the books looked at morality, persecution, and what people will do for power. The series did cause me to briefly become obsessed with Wicca. This led to several research rabbit holes and an attempt to become Wiccan. However, now I can barely remember anything about Wicca, but what I do remember is that these books may not have been the most accurate depiction of it, but they were still very enjoyable, and were perhaps the first books that I read where they had non-straight characters. I could be misremembering, but I think I'm right. Perhaps my first foray into horror were through the Saga of Darren Shan by Darren Shan. So again, this is definitely not all of the books. They're in the same place as the Wicca books that I can't get to, but these are Lord of the Shadows and Sons of Destiny, which are the last 2 books. This series is about Darren, who becomes a vampire's assistant, and if I remember correctly, the first book starts on a toilet, so there's also plenty of humour in the books, and they were perhaps the first books that I read where they had some quite big character deaths, and they were grisly deaths as well, which may have actually caused them to impact me emotionally less than if they'd not been as grisly, but I'm not sure. As well as being where my love for horror started developing, I think it was also where my love for vampires started developing. So over my life I have read so many books featuring vampires. I don't think I read that much before I went to secondary school, but I do know that in secondary school I read loads. So I'll probably talk about that more in the next video. I've got no idea when I'm doing that yet, but it'll appear at some point. I also read more of Darren Shan works when I was in secondary school as well, but this was my introduction to him, and possibly the only series that I read in whole by him. I think it was in secondary school that I started to become quite bad at keeping up with series, especially if they were not all published, whereas this series, when I read it, it was all published. I read the first 3 books in a bind-up, loved it, and then got bought the rest of the series for Christmas, so I had no excuses not to read them. Now, there is a movie adaptation of the first book. I don't advise watching it, it's not very good. Then there is my first foray into manga, and that was with Fushigi Yugi The Mysterious Play This was by Whatasay, and this series is about Miyake and Yui, who, after opening an ancient Chinese book, are transported into the universe of the four gods. This is a parallel world to ancient China. We won't talk about the age I was when I read this, as some of the content was probably not age appropriate, but it was a series that I loved, and it caused me to seek out more manga and to start watching anime as well. I don't remember these books that well. I do remember really enjoying the romance plot. I enjoyed some of the predicaments that characters got themselves into. I can't remember what they are now, and I do wonder whether I would still find them funny. I do want to reread this series at some point. Unfortunately, I no longer have these books, as my mum accidentally gave them to someone else thinking that they belonged to them and not me. But that's a story for another day. Another series of books that I enjoyed were Dancing Shoes by Antonia Barber. These were about Lucy and her best friend Emma, who were learning ballet, and this led to another brief obsession, this time, unsurprisingly, with ballet. I tried to convince my mum to get me ballet lessons, but she wouldn't, as they were too expensive. And now that I'm older, I'm glad that she didn't, because I know my interest would have faded quickly. Despite that, this particular series did stay with me for a while, and I do remember rereading it at least twice, so I definitely enjoyed it. Then there's the Girls series by Jaqueline Wilson. Jaqueline Wilson was a really popular author when I was a kid, but I didn't actually read that much by her. The Girls series, I don't think it's as well known as, let's say, the Tracy Beaker books, or Vicky Angel, which I think was super popular. But the Girls series is about Ellie, who is a teenager with self-esteem issues, and we basically see her navigating friendship, love, body image, and a host of problems which are fairly normal for teenagers to experience. I gained a new appreciation of these books by reading them as an adult. I think they covered so many problems and issues that teenagers face, and I think they were done quite well. I think they were done in a way where you could learn from them, so that if you face these problems yourself, you could do the right thing, not be as negatively affected by them, and you could probably see yourself in the characters. And I think seeing problems that you face represented in what you read can make you feel less alone and can have a positive effect on you. So I think that these books were good in that way. I didn't tend to notice that much as I was reading them. It might be because I was younger than the characters that I was reading about, and although I did face the problems that they faced, I didn't face them until I was a little older than I had been when I was reading them. So it could have been interesting to see whether they would have affected me differently if I'd read them when I was the same age as the characters, compared to when I did read them when I was a few years younger than them. The next set of books I've lumped together as they have one theme, and that is horses. Yes, I was a bit of a horse girl. I don't know what came first. I don't know if I became interested in horses because I read about horses, or if I read about horses because I was already interested in them. I think the first horse series I read was Horses of Half Moon Ranch by Jenny Oldfield. These books were about Kirsty, who lives on a dude ranch in America. So a dude ranch is a holiday destination where you mostly ride horses, and you ride them on trails out in the country, and I think you tend to ride Western style. Kirsty was forever getting into trouble because of horses, usually because she was trying to save them. So this led her to entering abandoned mines. It led her to confront someone with a gun. Bear in mind, I don't think she was even a teenager in these books. I reread them recently, and there were so many times when I wondered, where was the parental supervision? She definitely should not have been getting into so many of the situations that she found herself in. So when I read these books as a child, I would have given most books 5 stars. Reading them as an adult, they don't really hold up as much, but again, I'm way older than the target audience, and I think that's got a big part to play in that. From this series, I moved on to the Heartland series by Lauren Brooke. The series is about Amy, who in the first book loses her mother in an accident. Then she basically takes over her mother's business, despite still being at school, which is to work with horses with behavioural issues. Often these horses have been abused or neglected, So although this series is about horses, what actually stood out to me were the characters in it. They were written really well and really realistically. The relationships between them were also written well. And this series was one that led me to cry so many times. It has been made into a TV show. I am currently on season 19 and it is perhaps my favourite TV show. It's very different than the books. They started off similar and quite a few episodes of the show marred up with one of the books. But as it's gone on, it's digressed a lot. And I feel that it doesn't focus on the horses so much now, but focuses on the family drama. And I'm finding that I'm enjoying the TV show more than the last time that I read the books. So it's well worth a watch. So next is the Silver Brumby series by Elyne Mitchell. This is set in Australia and is about wild horses, specifically Farah and his descendants, who stand out because of their coat colour. Their colouring makes them desirable to humans, and quite a lot of the books are about them trying to not be captured. But there's also plot points around problems with other horses or problems with nature. I only have 4 books, which are Silver Brumby, Silver Brumby's Daughter, Silver Brumby Kingdom, and Silver Brumbies of the South. There are a lot more books, which I didn't actually know when I first read these. When I read them, I thought that this was it. And it was only the other year that I discovered that there's more. So I do want to reread these and perhaps continue with the series as well. There were other horse series and standalones that I read, but these were the ones that stood out to me and that I remember. And although I'm not that interested in horses now as I used to be, they played a big part in my childhood. So these books were quite influential on me at the time. So those were a number of books from my childhood that I believe shaped me and shaped my reading. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do plan on doing a second one of these, which is focusing on the books that I read in secondary school. I also plan on rereading some of these books and perhaps doing reading vlogs for them. And then I also want to read some of the books that I missed as well. So they would be books that were popular at the time that I never got around to reading. So let me know if there's any particular series that you want to see me read or any particular standalone as well. So let me know in the comments if there's any specific series or standalones that you think that I'd enjoy or that were influential to you, as I'd love to read them. And if you've read any of the books that I've mentioned today and want to talk about them in the comments, go ahead as well. And as always, like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will catch you in the next one.